And now it's my pleasure to introduce our session and our esteemed speaker, Ben Ettinger, the Director of Product at Glassboard. We'll be discussing how to master verification validation for market-ready medical devices. Ben has extensive experience in this field and will provide us with valuable insights and practical tips. Ben, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Well, hello and welcome everybody to Mastering Verification and Validation for Market-Ready Medical Devices, how to plan, execute, and document V&V activities. As Alex mentioned, I'm Ben Ettinger, I'm Director of Product at Glassboard. Glassboard's a full-stack product development firm that helps our clients go from concept to commercialization of physical or hardware-based products. And my role is principally one of ensuring there's alignment between our customer's vision and the product strategies and technical execution that we roll out throughout the product development lifecycle. So my background is one of R&D engineering and design. So I think about verification and validation through that lens of a designer, and I'm hopeful that today I can share a bit about how elements of design thinking can lead to better validation about verification and validation for your medical devices. Oh, and make sure I can move from one to the next here. Here we go. An outline for what we're talking about today. Obviously, what verification and validation is, or V&V, providing a framework for V&V, looking at the hows, whens, and whats of verification and validation, as well as some pitfalls to avoid and how to document and defend your work. I'll start off before I dive into verification and validation, just with a quick anecdote or a quote, not necessarily attributed to any one person, but more a sentiment that I hear all too often in this space, which is, I followed the regulation perfectly, but the product failed anyways. This is something that I've experienced in my career, and I hear all too often, but the sentiment is targeted at when we get too bogged down in the letter of the law or following the regulation to a T, so much that we miss the forest from the trees and forget the spirit or the intent of the regulation and the prudent engineering behind it. So if you're on this call, I assume you're in medical device or healthcare in some capacity. And if you're like me, you probably got into this space to make the world a better place and make an impact, which is why often for product development projects, you will see patient safety and improving patient safety or improving patient outcomes as the North Star, which I agree with wholeheartedly. But I think there's also a tail to that conversation that is often missing, which is those improved patient outcomes leading to business success that often unlocks the continued innovation that leads to the next generation of products that makes a positive impact in the world. So when thinking about it through that lens, there is sort of this 2x factor to the reward of getting product development right, and this 2x factor of the risk of getting it wrong and stifling that continued innovation. So it's a framing that I think about when I'm looking at how to approach design controls and verification and validation specifically. Okay, jumping into the FDA framework. So this is taken straight from the design control guidance for medical device manufacturers. And I'd assume most folks have probably seen this and are acquainted with it in some respect. So this is starting off and showing user needs as that foundational element to your design controls, and that giving way to design inputs, the design process, design outputs, and the final medical device. And showing this link in this relationship whereby we verify our design outputs meet our design inputs, and we validate our final medical device satisfies our user needs. I will promise to at least try not to bore you all with copy and paste regurgitations of the regulations in this deck. So actually, I'll skip past these for now, and if folks have questions about the specifics, we can jump back to these during Q&A. But I've included a slide here just to kind of summarize these at a high level. So user needs, these are the intended use and user and patient expectations around device functionality, performance, safety, and use conditions. So I like to frame these as, or word them rather as the user expects blank. So these are broader phrasings for user needs around what the user expects of the device. Those give way to design inputs, and this is a many to one scenario. It may take many design inputs to satisfy a single user need. But design inputs are the physical and performance requirements for the device based on the user needs. So these should be objective, verifiable statements about the device that should stand on their own 2 feet, and even without the rest of the context, be clear as to the specification for each design input. Design outputs are the work product or results of the design process that fulfill the design inputs. These might be things like schematics or control drawings or procedures that come out of that design process. I like to think about the design outputs as the recipe for the product. You should be able to look at the full suite of the design outputs and go and be able to build the thing. Verification is the process of evaluating that those design outputs ensure, or rather they satisfy the design inputs. And validation is the process of evaluating the final device design to ensure that it satisfies the user needs. Okay, zooming all the way out, you'll see these sort of phrasings for a simplification or a way to think about verification and validation, where verification is answering the question, did we design the device right? And validation is answering the question, did we design the right device? And I agree with those phrasings and those simplifications, but I do have a couple bones to pick with the structure that we've laid out so far. The first being design controls as the FDA describes them. They say validation for the end. If I did a pure reading, I would say validation for the end, and that's what I see many individuals and organizations doing. But in my experience, that is a mistake, and it is somewhat logically incoherent if we go back to those questions, asking yourself, did we design the device right, before we ask ourselves, are we even designing the right device to begin with, is sort of out of sequence. So certainly there's a ton of validation to be done at the end of a product development cycle, but there is also a ton of validation work to be done at the beginning. So expanding on that sort of simple waterfall from the beginning, we need not get into all the stages here, but a 10-stage cycle or process that we follow for product development. I'm here just wanting to illuminate that the first 3, nearly 30% of the work we do, it predates any core development activities that most folks would think of as the true design, build, test pieces of product development. Nearly 30% of the front end is all targeted at just validating the premise and answering the question, are we solving the right problem to begin with? And are we planning to solve it the right way? And I'm bringing this up because your solutions and verifying and validating those solutions are only as good as the questions you're asking at the outset. The next bone to pick is that design controls, as the FDA describes them, are built off of user needs. And don't get me wrong, I love user needs. They're a core piece of how I step through design controls, but if that were the only tool in the toolkit, it would be lacking. I'll offer up a quote, maybe dubiously attributed to Henry Ford, but the quote is, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So this is just bringing to light that users are not always the best judge of what they should want in a product or what they need in a product. And oftentimes they're very poor judges of what they should want or need in a product. So relying solely on those user voices to dictate what the product ultimately becomes will not paint a big enough picture for what could lead to innovation in your product development. So what we employ is what we call stakeholder-centered design, which is not a term that we coined, but rather one that came from the design community. And it has a few orienting principles that we follow, one of which being users are only one piece of the puzzle, and acknowledging that they're not enough to deliver innovative and successful products. Rather, you have to employ systems thinking to look at the interests of each stakeholder in the ecosystem and across the life cycle of a product. And furthermore, not just looking at those individual stakeholders, but how those individual stakeholders influence one another and their environment and how their environment influences them. So I like to break those into 5 categories when I'm generating those user needs. The first being pretty obvious: users, the individuals operating the product or the service. Then the use environments, where the setting, the environment, the conditions in which the product will be operated. Then looking at customers, the individuals or organizations that will be making a purchase of the product or service. Then the beneficiaries. These are going to be the individuals that are deriving the benefit from the product existing in the first place. And then the insiders, the individuals or organizations that are involved in bringing the product to life or involved in the product development. So by way of example, I have the image here of the Da Vinci surgical robot and how I might think about these categories for a product like that. So looking at users, we would have the surgeons, nurses, technicians, IT staff, cleaners, students, etc. And we would also have the use environments for the hospitals, the operating rooms, universities. We'd have all of those in the United States and outside of the United States. And geography would be an important aspect to consider here. Customers, we would have hospitals, finance departments, committees, insurers, universities, all with responsibilities around making these purchases. We'd have beneficiaries. Obviously, the patients are deriving benefit from this product, but also the surgeons whose workflows may be expedited or whose work may be more precise with the introduction of this product. And then the hospitals who may see lower rates of adverse events through the introduction of the product. And then finally, the insiders, the founders, the C-suite, designers, engineering, marketing teams, sales teams, etc., that all are behind the curtain in the product development cycle. So all of these voices should be considered when looking at how to structure product development and ultimately what the product should become. Okay, so we looked at sort of the risk of not identifying the right problem statements at the beginning and how that could lead to your verification and validation, for lack of a better term, being meaningless on the back end if you're solving the wrong problem. But what happens if you get all of that right, but then you still fail to get V and V correct? You may find yourself with headlines like this. This is a product by Hillrom, and I mean not at all to pick on Hillrom. This is just an example. But this is a product by Hillrom that was targeted at incontinence management, and they found themselves with the headline, FDA issues the highest alert over hospital beds that could kill patients, with kill in all caps. This is not a headline I would want to attach to any product that I'm behind. And so what happened here? Ultimately, this was a class 1 recall where RF emissions from their device were interfering with other medical devices that were critical to the health and well-being of patients. And the ramifications here were the need to immediately locate and remove all of these devices from their clinical care facilities. And before we dive into what they may have gotten wrong here, let's look at the cost of this mistake. So the cost of cleanup on the back end and catching this mistake in the field is a huge amount of corrective action engineering, rework and scrap, a major uptick in your technical service and support needs, and fighting battles on the public relations front and the legal fronts, all of which are hugely expensive, versus the cost of doing it right from the start, which is just a healthy dose of preventive action engineering or prudent engineering. So even if we take that their early design controls were in place and inadequate, what we can say just from looking at this is their validation based on the definition we put forward that it needs to be in the actual or simulated use environments must have been lacking. There obviously was a significant gap between the conditions in which the product was validated compared to what was borne out in the field and what was observed in the field that led to this recall. So how do we prevent that from happening? Well, I break it into 3 tiers: planning, executing, and documenting. And I will go ahead and bury the lead. This is not a sequential path here. Documenting is something to be done every stage and at every step of the way, not to be saved for the end. And I'll offer up one more quote here. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. This, to me, perfectly captures how I think about verification and validation, in that the major work is in the preparation and the planning. And if you can nail that and get it right, the execution will fall into place. So I'll spend some time here talking about planning for verification and validation. The first being, make sure you feel rock solid about your user needs. We spent a bit of time already talking about this, so I'll try to breeze through this, but going back to, did all stakeholders inform user need generation and confirmation? So were these user needs created in a bubble, or was a cross-functional team employed to come up with these user needs, and were they all confirmed? Next up, is there data to back up the user needs? So this is something actually I love about Greenlight Guru, the ability to link items and add notes to my design controls. There's no reason not to have that data there to support it and help tell the story of how user needs found their way into your design controls, and possibly more importantly, what things were left out and why. So a topic for a different conversation, but we have a separate framework we use for user stories and a bit of a statistical approach as to what finds its way ultimately into those design controls and what finds its way out. But having that paper trail and that story to tell can be hugely important to reviews, and even for yourself many months down the road when you forget why exactly you made all the decisions you did. And then finally here, shining a spotlight on the assumptions being made. So I mentioned user needs are often pretty broad, and rightfully so, and we're often making assumptions here, but the team should all come together and talk openly about what those assumptions are and ensure those are the correct assumptions to be made for your specific product. There we go. Make sure you feel rock solid about your design inputs. So again, medical devices are only getting more and more complex, with most being digital, physical products and often connected to the internet. The amount of disciplines needed to sufficiently generate and review design inputs is a growing number, not a shrinking number. So if you have a solo product development engineer or a solo project manager whose task it is to tackle design inputs in a vacuum, I would bet that those design inputs are going to be lacking, or there are going to be gaps in those design inputs. So they should be formed through a cross-functional lens. Next, in translating those user needs to design inputs, there are always going to be assumptions made about the intent of those user needs and how those get translated into verifiable requirements. So again, having that paper trail, if you can go back to those stakeholders that help draft those user needs, you can corroborate some of your assumptions. But again, documenting those assumptions is critical to build traceability into this process. And beyond individuals, there are many teams that need to come together to put a product into the world. And the earlier you can get those teams involved, the better the product development cycle will be for it. So the earlier you can bring in production or manufacturing teams or key suppliers so they can have a seat at the table when it comes to design inputs is only going to benefit your product. And then finally, are the requirements unambiguous, objectively verifiable, and self-consistent? So these should be, again, they should stand on their own 2 feet, and your design inputs shouldn't be conflicting with one another. And they should be informed through a thorough risk analysis. All too often, I have folks come back and say, okay, design inputs are all wrapped up, and the risk analysis hasn't even been started. So again, maybe a topic for a different conversation. Thinking about design inputs as totally done may not be the right way to think about it, but it is certainly not the right way to think about it if it hasn't been informed through thorough risk activities. Next up on planning, make sure you feel at least pretty decent about your design outputs. So why do I cross out rock solid and put at least pretty decent here? Frequently I see organizations a little scared to get off the starting block when it comes to verification and validation, because they're terrified that their design outputs are going to change and invalidate all of their results, which is a fair and a warranted fear. But in my experience, it is a matter of when, not if, your design outputs will change. They will change at some point. So this is a game and an art of looking at what stands to change, what are the risky items, and what's going to be justifiable for those changes with regard to your test results. And a good way to mitigate this or approach it is to introduce some bench testing to gauge your performance and where you're at in the product development lifecycle. Along that line, looking at which design outputs pose the greatest risk of failing to meet their design inputs. And if you are not a member of your technical team, I promise if you go to your R&D engineers and ask them what's keeping them up at night, they will have answers. So go ask those questions and see what's keeping folks up at night. And that will help you prioritize the order of operations when it comes to your testing strategy. Obviously, if you save those really risky items for the very tail end of testing, and then you have failures that lead to major design changes, you are likely to have to redo a lot of testing. But if you can front load some of those riskier items that might lead to big design changes, you can help project timelines and project budgets. Then finally, specifying form and content and having version control, just acknowledging that you are on a continuum of product development and making sure you have robust documentation in place for what version of the product is being used for what testing. Okay, on to creating your verification plan. So taken from the regulations, not an option, but you must or you shall include a verification plan that encompasses your testing methods, acceptance criteria, and as appropriate statistical techniques with rationales for sample sizes. Another question I get quite often is regarding interfacing devices or accessories. So if you are connecting or interfacing to another medical device, your verification has to include confirmation that those design outputs meet your design inputs when interfacing or connecting with those other devices. And then on the documentation front, just always every step of the way, looking at who is doing what when they're doing it, having that paper trail to stand by. This is a great stage to push out test protocol and report templates for your team to execute on and start beginning or start on a equipment calibration strategy. So you're likely going to have a suite of testing that's going to be in-house and a suite of testing that is going to be out of house. And just making sure you have a strategy for what equipment you need in place, what calibrations you need, and making sure you have the documentation in place to prove out those calibrations. The final one here is a big one. Create scenarios in your test plans that represent worst case. If the FDA doesn't feel like you represented worst case sufficiently, they will come back and ask you to revisit the testing and revamp it for worst case scenarios. So this is where I like to say, dream the nightmares, because if you get your product into the hands of enough people, they will find a way to use it in ways that you had never hoped or never thought people would. So really do your due diligence here on the front end, thinking about all the worst case scenarios for how the product could be used and test to it. The last thing you want to be doing is putting a product out in the world and holding your breath because you're fearful or you know that's going to be used in ways that you haven't tested it against previously. And creating your validation plan. So this is all the documentation burden, everything we just talked about for verification. But the distinguishing factor here is one, as we mentioned, validation. We are validating user needs, not design inputs. And this must be performed under defined operating conditions on production units or their equivalents. This is another question I get a lot, which is, don't we have to do validation on production intent units or production units rather? And the answer is not necessarily. We are given this out here of or their equivalents. The key here is making sure you know what you're up against, you have clear documentation to justify all the gaps between what it is that you're testing and what is a production unit. The testing of the production units or their equivalents have to take place under actual or simulated use conditions. Again, this is something that you should want to do even if the FDA didn't care about it. This is the way that you can ensure you're not holding your breath when you're putting that product into the marketplace and it's getting ready to be used by users of all different types and different use scenarios and environments. And finally, if applicable, your software, you should include software validation and risk analysis where appropriate in your validation. And looking at your testing strategy holistically, Your trace matrix is going to be hugely important, just connecting all the dots across all of your design controls and showing those relationships between your verification, your outputs and your inputs, your validation, and your user needs. And this is a key piece to consider in your testing strategy, is making sure you're encompassing all the regulatory requirements that are specific to your device. Here, no need to make life harder than it needs to be for you. Google can be your best friend here. The FDA database is also a great tool, but finding relevant product codes similar to the product that you are developing, identifying those consensus standards, taking those into account, and where 510Ks are available, you can look at testing that other folks have undergone and make sure you're considering that in your testing plan. As always, review these with all the stakeholders. So get a testing plan in place and review it with engineering, quality, regulatory, business, marketing, and any test labs that you may be working with. If you're still unsure about your plan, you always can request a pre-submission meeting with the FDA to review. Then defining the stages of development from prototype through production and creating a testing map with quantities needed of each. This is something that can be front-loaded, and your project managers and your engineers will thank you. But having a roadmap of what versions of the device will be suitable for which tests you want to run and how many of each prototype you'll need will help facilitate that product development roadmap. And then developing a stakeholder strategy for execution. So I mentioned it's pretty common to have a suite of testing that you can do internally and a suite of testing that is likely to be outsourced. Tests like biocompatibility or 60601 or FCC testing are traditionally tests that are easy to outsource, versus things that are pretty easy to insource can be things like fatigue, wear testing, or other types of mechanical testing. But as always, filtering all of this through a risk review. And I like to say never putting too much of a stake in the ground. As you move through, you will illuminate new risks for your device. And this should be an iterative process and always updated through that lens of risk management. And then boots on the ground for execution. What actually explicitly gets included in your testing documents? We need to look at what version of the device is being tested, whether that is the final and finished device, or if it is equivalent to the final and finished device, and if we can justify it. So having that, again, that documentation in place to paint a clear picture of any gaps between what we're calling equivalent and what is production. Then what is the sample configuration and size, and how is that determined? So back to what version of the device is being tested, how can we justify that that is suitable for the test that we're running? And how can we justify that the sample size was statistically significant for our testing needs? Then it's not a test if you don't have pass-fail criteria. So you have to have that in place, and there is a place for characterization tests. So there I would just say have assessment criteria in place for anything that's just going to be deemed a characterization test. Otherwise, be clear about pass-fail criteria. I like to phrase these in a bit of a binary. Define one thing and let everything else be the other. So define what justifies a passing result, and everything that is not that is a failure, versus trying to define both sides of the coin and leaving room for potential ambiguity. Next, describing how the data is going to be analyzed. And then also a piece that's not listed here, but should be included in your test report, would be any deviations from what is in your protocol to what actually happened when it came to execution for the testing. Then a discussion of if the results met the acceptance criteria and why or why not. And I always like to include in this discussion what came out of that. Did this bring about the need for a new test that we didn't previously know we needed? If so, include that. And that all just helps tell the story of what happened when and what led to the eventual full suite of testing that the product was subjected to. And then a question I get as well, but what if the testing fails? The first I would say is an odd congratulations. If you fail the test, that means two things. Hopefully, it means you put enough rigor into your testing plan that you were able to produce a failure. You weren't just checking boxes, and that's a great thing. Additionally, you caught that failure before it went to the field, which is an amazing thing. But then what do you do about it? In your test report, just thoroughly summarize the results. Seems common that I've seen folks, you get a failing result and you just want to toss that one out and keep redoing until you get a passing result. That cuts out so much of the story that you want to tell. So describe those failures, describe what you're going to do about them, open a change order to capture all the root cause investigation work and what design changes come out of that investigation work. Always revisit your risk analysis in light of the new results, then conduct your retesting and conducting retest as needed, and follow those same steps in sort of an iterative process until you get to the results you need, and ultimately update your design history file with your new outputs and testing results and release the new design. It's not as scary as it seems. Failing fast can be quite a good thing. And finally, documentation. I mentioned this earlier. This is something just to be done all along the way, not to be saved for the end. You don't want to get into the business of trying to do all the documentation at the very end or get into the business of backdating things. This is, I like to say, good design tells a good story, and good stories should be easy to follow. So this isn't hard to do. It is just capturing all those notes for the who's, what's, whens, and whys all along the way. And if you do it all along the way, you have this chronological story to tell, which is going to be defensible. And this all goes back to, even if the FDA did not care about this, it's something you should want to do. You will get many months down the road, you'll forget why you did things the way you did them or what led to design changes. And you'll be up against problems that you need to resolve, and those problems will be resolved much more expeditiously if you have this documentation in place. And then finally, an EQMS is an invaluable tool for this documentation piece. It keeps everybody in the same sandbox, playing by the same rules and playing the same game. Awesome. And that's everything I have. Alex, if you have anything, we can open up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. Before we get into QA, I want to thank everybody. Well, thank yourself, Ben, for providing a great comprehensive presentation.